The great irony of the galaxy, I've come to realize during my 7 cycles observing these peculiar bipedal mammals called humans, is that their greatest warriors often care least about recognition. Take Captain Lydia Frost, for instance. A name that should be carved into every monument across the known systems. Yet she just threw the highest military honor in the galaxy back at High Admiral Corvin's feet, like it was contaminated waste. "Keep your shiny trinket," she said, her voice carrying that distinctly human mixture of exhaustion and defiance that makes my translator hiccup. "Give it to someone who didn't watch half their crew turn into space dust." The silence in the ceremonial hall was so thick you could slice it with a plasma cutter. 2,000 beings from across 17 different species had gathered to witness this moment, and Captain Frost just refused. The Medal of Galactic Valor, forged from the rarest metals in the core worlds, blessed by the Council of Ancients themselves, and she treated it like a bad joke. I adjusted my recording device, my 3 eyes tracking every micro-expression on the faces around me. As a cultural anthropologist specializing in human behavior, moments like these are pure research gold. But even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Admiral Corvin, his blue-scaled face flushing an alarming shade of purple, cleared his throat with all the dignity he could muster. "Captain Frost, this medal represents the gratitude of every civilized world in the—" "Civilized?" Frost interrupted, and, oh, the laugh that escaped her was anything but amused. "You want to talk about civilized while the Nexari Death Fleet is still picking human bones from their teeth?" The assembled crowd shifted uncomfortably. The Nexari War had ended 3 months ago, technically. The ceasefire was holding, barely, but everyone knew it was more like a wounded predator catching its breath than actual peace. Captain Frost stood there, still wearing her battle-scarred armor, refusing the ceremonial dress uniform they'd offered. Smart woman. The scorch marks and dents told a story that no polished metals ever could. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and those distinctly human eyes, a startling shade of green, held the kind of weariness that comes from making impossible choices and living with the consequences. "The Battle of Kepler Station," she continued, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "cost us 800 good soldiers. The defense of the Tau Corridor, another 600. The final push to break their supply lines." She paused, and I swear I could hear every being in the room holding their breath. 1,237 souls who won't be going home. The numbers hit the crowd like a physical blow. I watched delegates from peaceful trade worlds flinch at the reality of what their comfortable lives had cost. "But sure," Frost said, that bitter laugh creeping back into her voice. "Let's have a party and hand out medals. That'll bring them back." High Admiral Corvin's diplomatic training finally kicked in. "Captain, your sacrifice and that of your crew will never be forgotten. This medal is not celebration, it's remembrance." "Then put it on their graves," she shot back. "I'm sure they'll appreciate the gesture." The captain turned on her heel and walked out, leaving 2,000 of the galaxy's most important beings staring at each other in shocked silence. Her boots echoed against the polished stone floor with each determined step, and I found myself following at a respectful distance, my curiosity overriding any sense of propriety. You see, this is what makes humans so fascinating. Any other species would have accepted the honor gracefully, made the appropriate speeches, and returned home to display their medal prominently. Humans. They have this annoying habit of caring more about the principle than the prize. Captain Frost made it exactly 4 corridors before the first group of younglings found her. Ah, the younglings. I should explain, for those unfamiliar with human military structure, that their ships often carry the offspring of fallen warriors. A peculiar custom, really, but one that speaks to their pack-bonding instincts. These weren't human children, mind you. The irony of the situation was about to become deliciously apparent. "Captain Frost." The voice belonged to a young Nexari, barely past his first molting, his predatory features still soft with youth. Behind him came 6 more, a mixed group of species whose parents had died fighting alongside humans in the war. The captain stopped, her shoulders tensing. "What do you want, cubs?" Cubs. Not children, not younglings, but cubs. The term carried weight in their language, implying both affection and respect for their potential as future warriors. The young Nexari, who couldn't have been more than 12 in human years, stepped forward. His name was Crix, I later learned, son of Commander Thale, who died covering the human evacuation of Mining Colony 7. "We saw what happened in there," Crix said, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Why did you refuse the medal?" Captain Frost studied the group for a long moment. 7 young beings, refugees and war orphans, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and confusion. The weight of their expectations was almost visible in the air. "Because," she said finally, "medals don't mean anything if the people they're supposed to honor are dead." A young Thraxian female, her chitinous plates still developing their adult coloration, stepped forward. "But Captain, my mother always said honors are for the living to remember the dead." "Your mother was wise, Xena," Frost replied, and I could hear the carefully controlled emotion in her voice. "But sometimes the living need to remember differently." She knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the group. This was pure human behavior, this instinctive need to physically lower themselves when addressing their young. Most species found it baffling, but I was beginning to understand its psychological impact. "You cubs lost parents in this war," she continued. "Some of you lost everything. A shiny medal hanging in some trophy case won't bring them back or make your loss any less real." The silence stretched between them, filled with the kind of understanding that transcends species barriers. These younglings had seen more than any child should, regardless of their biological nature. They understood loss in ways that most adults never would. "Will you tell us about them?" asked another cub. This one a Velkari whose parent had died in the same battle that claimed half of Frost's crew. "About our parents, I mean. The way you remember them?" And there it was, the moment that changed everything. Captain Frost's carefully maintained composure cracked, just slightly, and I saw something flicker across her face that my species doesn't have a word for. The closest translation would be protective fierce love, but that doesn't capture the full emotional complexity. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Yeah, I can do that." They found a quiet observation deck overlooking the spaceport, and Captain Frost began to talk. Not the sanitized official reports or the heroic narratives that would eventually make their way into the history books, but the real stories. The small moments of courage, the stupid jokes told under enemy fire, the way Commander Thale always shared his ration bars with anyone who looked hungry. I recorded it all, of course. This was exactly the kind of authentic human behavior that made my research so valuable. But as the hours passed and the captain's stories continued, I began to understand that I was witnessing something far more significant than just military anecdotes. These cubs, these children of a dozen different warrior races, hung on her every word. They laughed at the funny parts, their various vocal apparatus creating a strange but somehow harmonious chorus. They cried, in their own species-specific ways, at the sad parts. And through it all, they were bonding with this human who had refused her medal, but was giving them something far more valuable. She was giving them their heritage. As the station's artificial day cycle began to dim toward evening, the cubs started to drift away, called back by their guardians or simply exhausted by the emotional weight of the stories. But they didn't leave empty-handed. Each one carried with them a piece of their parents' legacy, told not in the cold language of military reports, but in the warm, living words of someone who had fought beside them. Captain Frost remained on the observation deck long after the last cub had left, staring out at the ships coming and going in the port below. I debated approaching her. My scientific curiosity warring with what I was learning was a very human need for privacy and grief. "You can come out now," she said without turning around. "I know you've been following me, Doctor. Quicks, isn't it?" My camouflage field flickered and failed as surprise overrode my control. "How did you—" "Your recording device clicks every time it cycles through a new data crystal," she said with what might have been amusement. "Plus, you smell like the research labs on Deck 7. I emerged fully from concealment, my embarrassment coloring my skin plates a deep orange. "I apologize for the intrusion, Captain. I was documenting the ceremony for cultural analysis purposes. Find anything interesting? She asked, finally turning to face me. Extremely, I admitted. Your rejection of the medal was unexpected. That laugh again, but softer this time. You want to know the real reason I refused it? I nodded, my recording device already whirring back to life. It wasn't mine to accept, she said simply. Every choice I made in this war, every battle we won, every life we saved, none of it was about me. It was about them. She gestured toward where the cubs had been sitting. The next generation. The ones who will have to live with whatever kind of galaxy we leave behind. She was quiet for a moment, her green eyes reflecting the running lights of the ships below. A medal is just metal and ceremony. But those stories I told tonight? Those will live on. They'll pass them down to their cubs, and their cubs will pass them down to their cubs. That's the real honor. That's the real memorial. I found myself nodding, though I wasn't entirely sure I understood the full implications of what she was saying. Human psychology was proving more complex than I'd anticipated, even after years of study. The cubs seemed to appreciate it, I offered. They're good kids, she said. Tougher than they should have to be, but good. They'll make fine warriors someday, if the galaxy needs them to be. But maybe. She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. Maybe we can build something better. Something that doesn't require quite so many warriors. It was nearly midnight, station time, when Captain Frost finally left the observation deck. I remained behind, reviewing my recordings and trying to process everything I'd witnessed. The formal ceremony had been exactly what I'd expected, all pomp and protocol and political necessity. But the real story, the human story, had happened in the hours afterward. I was so absorbed in my analysis that I almost missed them. The cubs had returned, moving through the corridors with the practiced stealth of younglings up to something they probably shouldn't be doing. All 7 of them, plus 3 others I hadn't seen before. They carried tools and materials scavenged from who knows where, and their destination seemed to be one of the maintenance workshops near the lower docking bays. My curiosity overrode my better judgment. Again. The workshop they'd chosen was officially decommissioned, slated for renovation but currently empty and unsupervised. Perfect for whatever secret project had brought them together in the middle of the ship's night cycle. Through a partially opened maintenance hatch, I watched them work. They had pieces of armor, battle-damaged and scarred, collected from the war's aftermath. Nixari carapace plates, human ceramic composite, Thraxian biosteel, Velkari energy-absorbing mesh, a dozen different alloys and composites, all bearing the marks of combat. And they were building something. "Hand me that plasma torch," Crix said, his young voice carrying the authority of someone taking charge. "Xena, can you shape that plate to match the curve?" The young Thraxian's mandibles clicked in concentration as she worked, her natural biomechanical abilities allowing her to mold the metal with her bare hands. The other cubs sorted through their collection, selecting pieces that seemed to call to them for reasons I couldn't fathom. "My father's armor," whispered a young human I hadn't seen before, running her fingers along a piece of scorched ceramic. "He was wearing this when—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They worked through the night, these children of war, creating something that transcended the simple craft projects I'd expected. What emerged from their collective effort was unmistakably a medal, but unlike any official honor I'd ever seen. It was rough around the edges, asymmetrical, clearly handmade by inexperienced workers. But it held a power that no ceremonial medal could match. It was made from the actual armor of the fallen, forged by the love of those they'd left behind. As the first light of the station's artificial dawn crept through the workshop windows, the cubs stood back to admire their work. 10 young beings, representing 6 different species, united by loss and love, and the very human notion that some honors can't be bestowed by authority. They have to be earned. "Now what?" asked Jax, the youngest human among them, his voice barely above a whisper. Crix hefted the metal in his clawed hands, feeling the weight of their creation. The morning shift would begin soon, and with it, the risk of discovery. Now we give it to her properly. You mean sneak into her quarters? Xena's compound eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and terror. The captain will space us if she catches us breaking into officer territory. Not breaking in, corrected Vera, a Keldon whose crystalline features caught the workshop's dim lighting. Delivering. There's a difference. The group exchanged glances, each species expressing nervous anticipation in their own way. Mandibles clicked, scales rippled, and bioluminescent patches flickered in rapid succession. She'll be in the mess hall, Crix decided. Officers eat early, before the general crew rotation. We present it there in front of everyone. A collective intake of breath, or its equivalent across various respiratory systems, filled the workshop. That's either brilliant or suicidal, muttered Nox, a young Vorthan whose tentacles writhed with anxiety. Probably both. They made their way through the service corridors, a small parade of determination wrapped in adolescent bravado. The metal passed from hand to claw to appendage, each cub taking a turn carrying their creation like a sacred relic. The officers' mess was exactly where Crix predicted it would be. Captain Frost sitting alone at a corner table, mechanically working through what appeared to be reconstituted protein and synthetic coffee. The dark circles under her eyes suggested sleep had been as elusive for her as it had been for them. "Remember the plan?" Crix whispered as they approached the entrance. Vera speaks first. She's got the best standard galactic pronunciation. Then Jax presents the medal. Human to human. Everyone else just try not to knock anything over. The automatic doors hissed open, and 10 pairs of feet, paws, and pseudopods carried them into the lion's den. Captain Frost looked up from her meal, fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Her expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and what might have been resignation in the space of 2 heartbeats. "Well," she said, setting down her utensil with deliberate care. "This should be interesting." Vera stepped forward, her prismatic skin shifting to deeper hues as nervousness kicked in. "Captain Frost, we have something for you. If this is about yesterday's stories, Cubs, I already told you everything I could remember." "It's not about the stories," Jax interrupted, then immediately looked mortified at his breach of protocol. "I mean, sorry, Captain, but it's something else. Something we made." Frost's eyebrows rose slightly. Around the mess hall, other early rising officers began to take notice of the unusual gathering. Admiral Corvin himself sat 3 tables away, his morning briefing materials forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. "You made something," Frost repeated slowly, "in the middle of the night. Without supervision. On a military vessel." The Cubs exchanged panicked glances. When she put it like that, their grand gesture suddenly sounded like a court-martial offense. "We didn't break anything important," Xena offered hopefully. A sound escaped Captain Frost that might have been laughter, or might have been the last gasp of her sanity. "Show me." Jax stepped forward, the metal cradled in his small hands like he was carrying liquid fire. As he held it out, the morning light from the mess hall's viewport caught the amalgamated metals, casting fractured rainbows across the assembled surfaces. "We know you refuse the official medal," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But this one's different. It's not from the council or the military brass. It's from us. From the Cubs whose parents fought with you." Captain Frost reached out slowly, her fingers hovering over the rough-hewn creation without quite touching it. The silence in the mess hall was absolute, even the atmospheric processors seeming to hold their artificial breath. "You made this from their armor," she said. Not a question, but a recognition that cut straight to the heart of what they'd done. "Every piece," Crix confirmed. "My father's carapace plate, Sergeant Martinez's chest armor, Commander Yala's biomesh, Dr. Thorne's environmental suit. We found them in the salvage bay, waiting to be recycled into hull plating. Instead of letting them become just another piece of the ship," Vera added, "we thought they should stay together. Stay remembered." Captain Frost finally took the medal, her calloused hands closing around the uneven edges. For a moment, I thought she might refuse this one too, throw it back at the Cubs with the same bitter words she'd used on Admiral Corvin. Instead, she started to cry. Not the dramatic weeping of some species, but the distinctly human response of moisture leaking from her eyes while her facial expression remained carefully neutral. A few drops splashed onto the metal's surface, mixing with the metal that had once protected the people she'd failed to bring home. "You magnificent little troublemakers," she whispered. The cubs looked at each other uncertainly, unsure if tears meant success or disaster in human emotional vocabulary. "Is that good crying or bad crying?" Knox asked, his tentacles curling into worried knots. "Good," Frost managed, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Definitely good. But also, completely inappropriate behavior from a ranking officer in front of her crew." She stood abruptly, the metal clutched against her chest, and I watched every officer in the mess hall snap to attention. Even Admiral Corvin rose from his seat, his scaled features showing an expression I'd never seen before. Something approaching humility. "Cubs," Captain Frost announced, her voice carrying that parade ground authority that could cut through the noise of a plasma storm. "You have committed multiple violations of military protocol. Breaking into restricted areas, unauthorized use of salvage materials, conducting unsupervised manufacturing operations, and disturbing a superior officer during her meal." The younglings' faces fell in unison, a symphony of disappointment across multiple species. "Therefore," she continued, and now her voice carried a different quality entirely, "you will report to my ready room at 1400 hours for your punishment detail." She paused, letting the weight of official discipline settle over them. "Which will consist of helping me write proper commendations for each of your parents' service records. Because if we're going to honor the fallen, we're going to do it right." The transformation was instantaneous. 10 young faces, representing 6 different evolutionary paths, all lit up with identical expressions of joy and pride. "Now get out of here before I remember that I'm supposed to be the stern commanding officer who doesn't show favoritism to underage crew members." They scattered like leaves in a solar wind, chattering excitedly in a mixture of languages as they headed for the mess hall exit. But Crix lingered for just a moment, his predatory features serious beyond his years. "Captain," he said quietly, "will you wear it?" Captain Frost looked down at the medal, then up at the young Nexari, whose father had died saving human colonists he'd never met. "Every day," she promised. After the cubs left, the mess hall remained silent for a long moment. Admiral Corvin approached slowly, his diplomatic training warring with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Captain Frost," he began carefully, "perhaps we could discuss—" "No," she interrupted. "Whatever political angle you're working, whatever propaganda value you think this has, the answer is no. This stays between me and them." "I was going to suggest," Corvin continued with surprising patience, "that we might establish a formal program. Other war orphans, other ships. This kind of healing might be exactly what the fleet needs." Captain Frost studied the Admiral's face for several seconds, clearly looking for the trap in his words. "You're serious. Dead serious. What those cubs did, what you did with them yesterday and just now. It's the first genuine act of unity I've seen since the ceasefire. Not political theater, not diplomatic necessity. Real connection across species lines." She turned the handmade medal over in her hands, feeling the imperfections that made it perfect. "It would have to be voluntary," she said finally. "No pressure, no mandatory participation. And the cubs choose their own materials, their own designs, no standardization, no official approval process." "Agreed. And I want full authority over the program. No committee oversight, no bureaucratic interference." "Also agreed, within reason." Captain Frost looked up sharply. "Define reason, Admiral." Corvin's smile was the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him since arriving on the station. "Reason is making sure you don't work yourself to death trying to personally counsel every war orphan in the fleet. You'll need assistance, other officers who understand what you're trying to accomplish." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "I might know a few candidates." As they talked, working out the practical details of what would eventually become known throughout the fleet as the Heritage Program, I found myself thinking about the true nature of human psychology. They had taken something broken, these cubs and their adopted human captain, and made it whole again. Not repaired, because that would imply returning to an original state. Instead, they had created something entirely new from the fragments of what had been lost. The medal that Captain Frost now wore against her uniform was ugly by conventional standards. Asymmetrical, rough-edged, clearly amateur in construction. But it carried a weight that no ceremonial honor could match, because it was made from love instead of duty. From grief transformed into hope. Over the following weeks, I watched the program take shape. Cubs from other ships began arriving, carrying their own collections of salvaged armor and equipment. Each group created something different, reflecting their unique losses and their species' particular talents. A Thraxian-led team produced a memorial sculpture that sang in harmonics only their kind could fully appreciate. A mixed group of human and Velkari orphans created matching bracelet sets, one for each fallen warrior and one for themselves. But the most remarkable change was in Captain Frost herself. The bitter edge to her humor began to soften. The shadows under her eyes gradually faded as she found new purpose in guiding these young survivors. She never became cheerful exactly, but she developed something that might be called contentment. And she wore that ugly, beautiful medal every single day, just as she'd promised. 3 months later, the Nexari delegation arrived for the formal peace treaty signing. The war was officially ending, not just paused, and the ceremony would be broadcast across every world in both empires. Captain Frost was scheduled to receive her original medal again, along with several other honors she'd accumulated during the war's final months. The political necessity had become unavoidable, Admiral Corvin explained apologetically. But this time, she didn't refuse. She stood on the ceremonial platform, wearing her dress uniform and accepting each honor with appropriate dignity. But underneath the official decorations, clearly visible against the dark fabric, was the medal the Cubs had made for her. When the Nexari war leader stepped forward to personally thank the humans who had fought so fiercely, his compound eyes fixed on that rough-hewn creation. "That medal," he said in heavily accented standard, "it is not regulation design." The assembled crowd held its breath. A diplomatic incident at this moment could shatter the fragile peace they'd all worked so hard to achieve. Captain Frost met the war leader's gaze steadily. "No, sir, it's not. It was made by Cubs whose parents died in this war. Cubs from both sides, working together." The war leader was silent for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh. The deep, chittering sound of Nexari amusement that most species found unsettling. "Both sides," he repeated. "Including Nexari Cubs?" "Including your son, actually," Captain Frost replied calmly. "Crix helped forge the central piece." The war leader's laughter stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, his eyes found the young Nexari in the crowd, standing proudly with his fellow Cubs. "My son made you a medal. Your son helped honor the memory of those who died, serving their beliefs, regardless of which flag they served under." The war leader studied the medal more closely, his enhanced vision picking out details the rest of us couldn't see. When he looked up again, his expression had changed entirely. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "this is how peace actually begins. Not with treaties and ceremonies, but with Cubs teaching us that honor has no species." He reached into his ceremonial robes and withdrew his own medal, the highest decoration the Nexari Empire could bestow. Without ceremony, he pinned it next to the Cubs' creation on Captain Frost's uniform. "For showing us what we had forgotten," he said simply. The crowd erupted in cheers, but I barely heard them. I was too busy watching the Cubs, all of them, human and alien alike, beaming with pride at what they had accomplished. They had started with broken armor and bitter hearts, these young survivors, but they had forged something far more valuable than any medal. They had created hope. And sometimes, I realized as I watched Captain Frost embrace young Crix while his father looked on with glowing eyes, sometimes hope is the only honor that truly matters. The treaty was signed that day, but the real peace had begun months earlier, in a workshop full of determined cubs who refused to let their parents' sacrifice be forgotten. That night, as the celebrations continued across the station, I found Captain Frost back on the same observation deck where she'd first told her stories. She was surrounded by cubs again, but this time the group included young Nexari from the diplomatic delegation, eager to hear about their own parents' courage from someone who had fought against them with respect rather than hatred. "Dr. Quicks," she called out as I passed. "Still documenting our strange human behavior?" "Always," I admitted, settling into a comfortable recording position. Though I'm beginning to think it's not as strange as I originally believed. "Oh, we're definitely strange," she laughed. "But maybe that's not always a bad thing." As she began another story, this one about a Nexari commander who had personally escorted human civilians to safety during the evacuation of Colony Prime, I realized that my research had fundamentally changed direction. I had come here to study human psychology, to understand what made this species so effective in warfare. But what I had discovered instead was something far more complex and beautiful. Their incredible capacity for turning enemies into family, for building bridges from the wreckage of conflict, for teaching their young that honor belongs to everyone who serves something greater than themselves. The medal still hung on Captain Frost's uniform, catching the light from passing ships. Ugly and perfect, amateur and priceless. A reminder that sometimes the most meaningful gifts come not from authority, but from love. And as the cubs laughed at the funny parts of her story and grew solemn at the heroic sacrifices, I knew I was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. A generation that would grow up understanding that courage has no species, that honor knows no flag, and that the real victory in any war is learning how to build peace from its ashes. That medal, forged by predator cubs in the dark of night, had become something far greater than its makers ever intended. It had become a symbol of possibility, proof that even in the aftermath of the galaxy's bloodiest conflict, hope could still take root and grow. And Captain Lydia Frost, who had refused recognition from her superiors but accepted it from the hearts of children, wore it with more pride than any official honor could ever inspire. The story was complete, but the legacy had only just begun.